And I'm going to start this panel off by quoting that article. As thrilled as I am by all the new clinical studies exploring the medical potential of psychedelic drugs, I still long for the day when our best minds and resources can be applied to the study of these extraordinary substances with an eye that looks beyond their medical applications toward their ability to enhance human potential and explore new realities. Very good. So, you know, it's an amazing, amazing thing to kind of take note of where we are in the new wave of psychedelic research. There's no question about that. The new wave of psychedelic research has been a tremendous success, getting headway in many mainstream therapeutic areas and treating some very, very crucial disorders that affect many, many of us. But looking beyond those disorders, as the title of the panel suggests, what's the future of psychedelics now? And I know David and Daniel specifically, you guys might have a real opinion on that, because definitely over the last 10 years, a lot's changed. And in my opinion on where the future of psychedelics is going has certainly changed in the last 5 years. But let's start with that. Start with you, David, since you started this.
Tremendous changes going on. I mean, I think that the research going on right now with MDMA and post-traumatic stress disorder, and psilocybin obsessive compulsive disorder, and ibogaine, and opiate addiction, they're just so wonderful. We've been waiting for so many years for this, but I've been personally waiting. I mean, there was no psychedelic drug research from 1972 to 1990. We're in the midst of a medical renaissance right now with psychedelics. And what's going to happen when we can finally cure most of these ailments and move beyond it, when we have the resources and the manpower to be able to systematically study some of these other areas. And the other areas that I see coming along are advanced forms of learning, being able to use psychedelics to learn more effectively, more quickly, to imprint in new ways and to learn new dimensions of things. Thomas Roberts talks about this quite a bit in his book of The Future of the Psychedelic Mind. I see the science of pleasure developing. I think one of the most unspoken things about psychedelics, besides their therapeutic value, is that they're enormously fun and that they can produce enormous amounts of pleasure. And wouldn't it be wonderful to systematically explore this and to really see how it can be applied in new ways, combining it with music and culinary, culinary creativity and massage therapy and tantra and all these different things, but really study it scientifically and see. The study of psychic phenomena, most people don't know, is an area that's been scientifically studied for the past 100 years or so. It has gotten enormously consistent positive results, and people have been reporting paranormal psychic experiences, telepathy, precognition, things like that with their psychedelic experiences, mostly anecdotal. There's been a few pilot studies done with psilocybin, but it would be so wonderful to really see these areas explored systematically, to do all the telepathy tests and precognition tests with people on ayahuasca and LSD and psilocybin, and see if their scores can be improved and what we can learn from that. It can be used for creativity, for problem solving. There were studies done in the 60s. Oscar Janiger and James Fadiman did studies to show that it improves not only artistic creativity, but improves problem solving abilities among a whole wide range of professional activities. Probably most interesting of all, though, is that we could explore the possibility of communication with non-human entities, exploration of parallel universes, and whatever these hyperdimensional realms that people report on their DMT journeys. And then finally, this could be taken to the area to actually study divine intelligence, God itself. If God truly exists, if there is divine intelligence, then ultimately this is going to become a branch of physics, and this will become something that we can study. And we already know that psychedelics consistently produce mystical and spiritual experiences, so this could be an avenue towards being able to study this on a much deeper level.
Daniel, I'd like to hand this over.
Wait, you didn't leave much left.
We're done, folks.
No, I agree with all of that. I mean, I think that we're at a kind of a civilizational precipice where we see what's happening with like Trump and this kind of mania that seems to be very like constricting in terms of awareness and consciousness. So either like consciousness is this realm that has like much greater dimensions to explore, or we seem like we're going, we're going to hit a hard stop soon. Luckily, if you've had the psychedelic experiences, you do realize that there is tremendous realm for exploration. That it's like a frontier that we haven't even really touched yet. It's like brand new territory in a sense. I also really love the Tom Roberts book, The Psychedelic Future of the Mind. One of the ideas he has in that book is that we could look at the rediscovery of psychedelics in the modern world as a second Reformation. The first Reformation was when the Bible was translated into the common languages, and people who could only experience like the Word of God, through the priests, were suddenly able to read it for themselves. And then with the second Reformation, not only can we read it for ourselves, we can have those experiences. So this idea that we're entering a second Reformation, I think, is very fascinating. Ultimately, this idea that we can reintegrate, science and mysticism, science and spirituality, and have like a secure paradigm, maybe for the future. In a way, we've got this sort of like the materialist science camp and the mystical experience, the psychedelic camp, and if we can bring those together, then we actually have kind of like a solid framework, and maybe for the future. All the other aspects of it, I think are crucial. You talked about psychic phenomena. Tom Roberts talks about how we actually seem to have a tremendous range of what he calls mind-body states that could actually be categorized and understood, and that we actually have different capabilities and capacities in these different mind-body states. So what an amazing area for future research. And as James also knows, there are some groups that are beginning to explore in a scientific framework, could you actually figure out the validity of entities that are encountered in psychedelic states? Is there a way to verify through like double blind or sending people together into these other realities? Could they actually begin to come back in a way that you could say, okay, there are these entities that have information that we can sort of verify independently. So that's all super fascinating.
And there's so many great things worth said between the two of you. I just want to extract that for just a second, and what I like to call the re-ignition of mysticism, which is something that is really, especially in Western culture, has been somewhat absent since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. And now that we are seeing this kind of collective consciousness, group expansion and return into mystical states, these shared dimensions that both David and Daniel, you guys both talked about, are commonly experienced at DMT and ayahuasca. So many people report similar visions, similar descriptions from these specific substances. What is that? What's going on there?
That's such a fantastic question.
For any of you guys, James, Ben, anyone?
There was this astrophysicist. We did these events in Thüringen in England that brought together a lot of psychedelic, explorers, scientists, thinkers, with some scientists from other fields. And there was an astrophysicist there who said, he was willing to entertain the idea that we know from, string theory, or at least it's one hypothesis, that there are these extra dimensions of space-time that are these like infinitesimal dimensions that are kind of, interwoven into this one. So maybe what you're experiencing through these different psychedelic states is actually these other dimensions that string theory talks about. And 5-MeO DMT, for instance, what if that's actually, because one idea is that there would be a loom, like a dimension of superstrings that are weaving like all of these different dimensions into existence simultaneously. That's sort of in itself outside of what we understand as space and time. So what if the 5-MeO DMT experience actually gives you that direct access to that kind of loom of vibratory superstrings that are outside of space-time, something like that.
Let me just say, another way of looking at this is that Rick Strausman, the DMT researcher at the University of New Mexico, suggested that the realities and the entities that we're experiencing in these hyperspace realms on DMT could be dark matter or dark energy, and that if we could eventually develop some type of camera system or video system to be able to photograph dark matter or dark energy, we might be able to verify the types of visions and experiences that people are having.
Yeah, just quickly, they already have technologies, I believe they're developing, where they can create mental imagery from people's dreams.
Yeah.
So why not apply that to these psychedelic visions? That would be an incredible, and eventually with virtual reality, you'd be able to have like complete experiences of them.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I wanted to go next, into the technological, framework and or integration. One of the great footnotes in psychedelic culture is, I didn't write it down, but what's the full title of Terrence's of the Archaic Revival? DMT and virtual reality. It's in the title, and that was what, 1991, right? So it's no accident that some of the early virtual reality pioneers and cyberspace pioneers, and Jaron Lanier, and of course Tim and Barlow, and all our old friends were psychedelic holdouts. So what's happening there? And where are some potential fusions that we can kind of see these two worlds now that we see the maturity of virtual reality kind of taking place? James?
I'm not a great fan of virtual reality, to be honest. I think a lot of the transhumanism and stuff that's coming is not a world that I like the look of. In many ways, I think we're going to be one of the last generations of human beings that actually live in this world and not in a weird, half real, half digital world that's going to have to be created because we're going to just leave such a trashed wreck of this world. We're not going to want to be in it. So I find a lot of the enthusiasm about those things to be a little frightening, I think, because I think it draws the attention away. I mean, I don't know what I think about the medicalization of psychedelics, because I think the medicalization of psychedelics is our current culture bringing the psychedelic perspective into a box that it can handle psychedelics in. I'm much more interested in our culture taking on a psychedelic perspective, because I think the psychedelic perspective is the perspective we need to learn to live in harmony with our environment.
And how do we do that?
That's the burning question at this moment in time, isn't it? I mean, I think psychedelics have reappeared on our cultural radar because they are at least giving us an option and giving us another view of another way that things can be. Because virtual reality is just the ultimate example of really creating our own reality with our mind, with our own technology and our own ingenuity. And to a certain extent, we create our reality with what we believe and the systems we make and the things that we pursue. So I think that, as a culture, we need to shift to a very different way of integrating. And psychedelics are the most likely tool to help us at this very, very, very late stage of the game. I mean, I kind of think it's too late, to be honest.
Yeah, well,
It's too.
first thing I'd like to say is, David, we've known each other for a while. I'll give you $10 if I can have a sip of your water.
You got it.
If someone could bring Ben a cup of water, that would be amazing.
And bring $10.
Thank you. Thank you.
So
Any of that, return to psychedelic consciousness or mysticism, technology, pick a thread.
man, I love all of it. I think the things that, being a documentary maker, I'm mainly reporting on things that I hear from other people that are deeper in the fields than myself. Having interviewed Roland Griffiths, he was talking about possibly using laser beams to actually enact certain regions of the brain that communicate amongst one another to then kind of like change history or like bring about psychedelic light states. There's many of endogenous ways of bringing on psychedelic like states through movement, through breath. Have any of you heard of extended state DMT? Raise your hand if you have. Okay, not enough to let it go. Basically, extended state DMT or DMTX would just be the intravenous continuous infusion of dimethyltryptamine And so the whole idea behind that, a friend of mine back in Boulder, Colorado, Dan McQueen from Medicinal Mindfulness, was in Shane Moss's documentary, I believe, is basically trying to push this forward as far as like, what are these other worlds that you can access? Are they really, Andrew Gallimore, who co-authored with Rick Strassman the paper, was saying the one thing about DMT that he believes is that it seems to be a little bit more of a structured reality that it brings you into than the distortion of the one that we're in. So what does that mean? How do we actually catch our bearings in that state, stay longer, extract useful information? Could we, you know, if these are more intelligent entities separate from ourselves or even parts of our chambers of our own intelligence, accessing them for longer, being able to catch our bearings and accessing them, could we solve major global crises within shorter amounts of time? So that, I mean, none of this do I really know enough about to say I support or I'm against, but as far as like the future, where could it go? I believe that technology seems to also be the one thing that seems to keep budging its way into the future of this. So the way that I take a look at it is I'm not really sure what the plant kingdom is. You know, is that a form of its own technology in and of itself, an intelligent form? I'm also very curious when I'm looking at things like AI, you know, the observer effect, you know, observing a wave and collapsing it into a particle. At what point, or if ever, would there be the ability for AI to be able to observe something and then change its state? These are all things that I find to be the topics that I keep hearing about the more that I interview people. A lot of it has to do with maybe the next 5-10 years. Where are we at now? What's going to be legally? Look 50, maybe 100 years down the line, are we talking, you know, when you were mentioning in that opening quote about human potential, where could we be if we actually had a really intelligent, wise way forward for the next 15, 20, 50, 100 years with these plants? Where can this technology actually take us? If you know Dean Radin, his book Real Magic, there's some weird shit going on in this world. I mean, and just the fact that we observe it, and why are we observing it? Well, you know, why do we observe it the way that we do? Thank you, Rebecca. So these are all the questions that I feel like need to be talked about a little bit more, because I do kind of agree with James. I don't really know if I like the direction that we're currently taking technology, but technology is just a tool. Could it be, you know, is it co-opted? Is it hijacked? Probably. Does it have to be that way in the future? It doesn't have to be anything. So where are we going to take it? Where are the people in this room going to take it? How can we start orchestrating more good? Because that seems to be the thing.
That really makes me think about the cognitive liberty discussion. And James, what you, and I agree very much with what you said about the medical box that is being so conveniently constructed around psychedelics. I mean, of course, I love what's happening. The research is amazing, but that, like, you know, every time I hear the MDMA discussion these days, it's like FDA, MDMA, FDA, and that's just like, wait, what? How did this happen?
There's a section in Michael Pollan's new book, it's quite fascinating, where he says we're Roland Griffith, and they go to the FDA proposing their trials for psilocybin, and the FDA says they had a very limited scope they were trying to get done. And I think it was for end-of-life type patients. And the FDA actually said, well, we've heard these things can be useful for depression, so why don't you widen the scope of your investigation? Which is totally unheard of. So Griffith and these guys went outside feeling like they're just the goose that had got the golden egg. But if you look at it the other way around, why is the US government telling these guys to start looking at using the psychedelics in these ways? Because A, they see there's a massive problem that's brewing. That, you know, is depression a disease, or is depression in the natural result of intelligent people seeing the human condition in the situation we're in? I mean, we've got to be a little bit insane to survive. I call it extinction denial in my first book. So I think depression's is a symptom of where we are at. So the idea of using LSD as a band-aid to make this system more bearable is not the direction I want to see psychedelics being used, personally.
It's definitely, it is very thought-provoking, and we could spend a whole panel talking about that for sure. But around the sensibility of, so speaking very pragmatically, just around the sensibility of extracting psychedelics a little bit anyway from the medical box that they are falling into and returning them back into the cognitive liberty fueled mystical ambitions that, that's really the roots of all psychedelic work. I mean, it started with shamans in our tribes, and as Shane Moss said in his great new documentary, like, the guy who could take the most psychedelics and talk about it, they made him the leader. That was the leader of the tribe. Like, that was really cool. That's the way it was.
That's quite true.
And that's what an amazing thought. And we've kind of lost that. So, but how?
That's definitely not Donald Trump.
It's definitely not Donald Trump, right? Yeah. So how do we sensibly reintegrate the cognitive liberty discussion? Because I'm not hearing much talk about policy these days.
Yeah, I think the legalization of cannabis is inevitably leading in that direction. You're seeing this magic mushrooms on the ballot in Oregon, and there's definitely people are starting to talk about it more. But this is what I've been saying for a while, that Roland Griffith's experiment, what's going on in Johns Hopkins with the recreation of the Marsh Chapel and the fact that they are scientifically proving that you can have a mystical experience on psychedelics, that's a legal basis to go to the Supreme Court and say, hey, this is a basic human right that human beings should be able to use substances that we've used for thousands of years. And I think that should be more central to the conversation.
And I also, it's not so much from out of comic relief, like the science of creativity and the science of pleasure, like, look at Love Me Do, then Sgt. Pepper's, like, that is, there you go. If psychedelics can do anything, the way it can spark and fuel our imagination and turn, creative thinking into something completely different.
I think the focus on the science and the medical model was necessary it was the only seam that was going to work to kind of get it back into the culture and propagate it in a way. And, once that, has achieved significant milestones, then it'll be very natural to talk about all the other possibilities. And then I think we'll also have to start talking about something that doesn't now get talked about very much, which is kind of the dark side of psychedelics and how they're not always positive and liberatory. They can actually cause people's negative character traits to become exacerbated.
I was going to actually end the panel with that, but since you took us here organically, I wanted to go down the line and ask everyone, with that being the case, and I agree, what is, if you have a model for how psychedelics can best be used within the general public? Is it like, the driver's license model? Is it sort of the psychiatric prescription model? Is it full legalization? What is
the problem. There isn't a model that applies to everybody. From various models that apply to different groups or different people in different situations and different. So I don't think you can really have a blanket approach.
I think that they're incredibly powerful tools that need to be used with great respect, and that people shouldn't use them without some sort of education. I think Tim Leary's idea that people should have something like not a driver's license, but a pilot's license, something a little more sophisticated than a driver's license. But I think that would actually be a good way of going about doing it. I think everyone should have the opportunity and the right to experiment with psychedelics. I don't think we need to have them prescribed by a doctor, but at the same time, I think that they're extremely powerful and need to be respected, and that people need to show that they're educated enough to use them properly.
Yeah, they're very, very powerful. This is true. They're also the oldest known medicine. And so we have many, many, many generations of examples of how to use them responsibly. The difference is that we don't live in that world anymore. I always look at the economic framework as, in a sense, almost like a matrix it's like a language, it's a way that we speak now, it's a way we interact with one another. It's become so embedded into the fabric of who and what we are that I think that needs to be addressed, because we come from however many years of propaganda now, so there's a large portion of the population that has a specific mindset. And so, I always like the idea of what is communication? How do we bridge a gap? And that comes by understanding the side that there may be some resistance from, and trying to find that middle ground rather than retreating to our extreme and really just holding our position so firm. So it's I look at it as a multi-dynamic system. We see things inside this little system, but it's also playing upon larger systems, and larger systems are playing upon what we're living with. So the things that we think are right and just and moral, a lot of the times when we break apart our worldview, it fits into a different system, and then the way you communicate and relate and feedback with that system is far different. So relating it back to the point is, as far as like the shadow side of psychedelics, and how do we address this shadow? I think we address it the same way we always have, with proper communication, but also recognizing that we're living in a world that's far different than our ancestors that had this, in isolated tribes and communities, a little bit of traffic back and forth, but it's a far different world. So the idea is how do we integrate the new now with the thing that's always been there? This is a question that, it's a topic that needs to keep coming up more and more, because I don't think there is any one answer, like James has said, because there's no one kind of person, and we have a system that treats everybody like one kind of person. It's blind to justice. So with that respect, new novel ways of thinking in how to approach this, preferably through meditation, psychedelics, ways to just break ourselves out of our default mode. This might be the way there. So if we have to start with driver's pilot's licenses and stuff like that, if that's the way it starts, great. But as long as some kind of progress is being made and the topic stays on the table.
Yeah, but I think there's a deeper issue in a way that, like this, psychedelics and shamanism are ultimately about, personal authority, and kind of sovereignty in a way.
Self-actualization.
And we do see, I always look at things. I wrote a book, 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, that was looking at these ideas from indigenous cultures, that there is kind of a shift happening between like worlds or dimensions. There's some huge, bigger prophetic process that's actually happening. And for me, what we see now with kind of like the complete collapse of the authority structure of our systems. Like who can believe in the government? I mean, the government's going to issue licenses for psychedelics. This government,
right,
that's
right.
putting kids into, detention centers and shooting them up with psychotropic drugs.
Right.
Like I'm not going to really think that that's really very valuable. But maybe this is all some part of a process where this movement towards cognitive liberty, self-actualization, sovereignty, is part of a process that leads to an overturning or transmutation of this present system, which we also know can't continue because it's destroying the physical environment we depend on.
Well, Daniel's new book, or latest book, How Soon Is Now, deals with a pretty deep dive into this topic. It's really excellent if you haven't read it. But where I kind of get hung up on this, right, is that in the 60s, in 1963, how many people had done psychedelics in America? Hardly anyone, right? So by the end of the 60s, by 1970, millions of people had tripped. And fast forward 50 years later, I don't know what the number is, but probably tens of millions of people have taken some form of psychotropic medicine.
It's probably in the 100 million now if you add India and everything. Yeah.
Right. But yet, here we are. Donald Trump got elected president. And yeah, I don't want that government giving me a driver's license, too. I get it. I get your point is very valid. But extracting the tactical plan of action, as you refer to it, Daniel, is tell me a little bit more about that, because that's where I get hung up, because I was of course, one of those people who is, and still is, naive enough to think that, hey, if more people turned on in an intelligent,
But
legitimate way.
it's a multi-generational process, right? I mean, I don't think it was just that the government made psychedelics illegal. I think it was also that people weren't ready. There were no elders. I mean, your father, when he started taking psychedelics in 1960, or something, he was 40 years old, and somebody who had a long history with alcohol. And 3 years later, he was like the guru of psychedelics, and that was because there was no, like now we would see that as impossible, because we have so many people who have 20 years, 30 years of history with them. So, even in the 70s, like John Lennon talked about how when he did so much LSD that he destroyed his ego, and it took him years to reassemble himself. So we had to go through these stages of kind of casualties, and and it still happens. We're still learning, we're maturing as a society. It's not happening in the mainstream media doesn't maybe fathom that. Although the media is now more receptive to the discoveries on the scientific side of psychedelics. But there's another process, which is an evolutionary process maybe, that is a little harder to fathom. And we'd like it to happen quicker, but it's just going to happen as it happens.
Well, I do think the Burning Man model is one it's worth looking at, the expansion.
Well, I was going to say, what about the question, is Donald Trump president? Because psychedelics took a lot of people out of the political process.
Fair enough, it's true.
I see what that's going on, is the smart people don't want, they just are so disgusted.
Well, nobody wants that job.
Well, if there was a way we could make psychedelics, if psychedelics could make people go out and vote, that would be really helpful.
I would just like to mention, though, that there's scientific evidence that psychedelics, particularly LSD and ayahuasca and magic mushrooms, are known to increase ecological awareness, to make people more environmentally aware, and then people get involved in environmental activities, they start recycling. There's scientific evidence for this. I'm not sure how it would affect voting so much right now, but I think the long-term, the long-term process of this is going to eventually make people more ecologically aware. I think it's the planet trying to heal itself right now. I think it's no accident that just 20 years ago there was no ayahuasca churches, and now they're in every major city. They're everywhere. It's proliferating. Magic mushrooms are everywhere. It's like a mycelium network growing all over the planet. I think the planet is trying to heal itself right now, desperately. Through us, it's trying to heal itself. And I think psychedelics are playing a key role in that. I think that's why psychedelic research is so primarily important, because it increases ecological awareness.
Yeah. No, that is an extremely, perhaps arguably the most important pressing issue of our time, right?
And increasingly so as time.
With every passing day, right?
Exactly.
Exponentially. I know, Ben, you've a lot of your film work. A lot of your film work is, talk more about the environmental.
Yeah, actually, so in the show Psychedelica, which David J. Brown is in, also Dennis McKenna, Shane Moss, Dr. Joe Tafur, and even Tom Hatsis that was here. So in that show, I speak a lot about the ecological impact because of people like David, who mentioned exactly what he was mentioning here. I always found it fascinating that why does this class of plants seem to mimic a neurotransmitter that puts us into a specific state, and why does the outcome seem to be something that most of the time, if looking at it anthropologically, causes for community bonding, a little bit more understanding of the interconnectivity of the world that we're in. And just a few points that I even made in the show was, if you just look at our common practices, call it ignorance or call it what you will, but just like the monoculture and the tilling and the severing of all of the mycelial connections and things that we have going on under the ground, that's just one aspect of our disconnection. You look at cities, and we're in the business of pushing nature out, except for domesticated nature. We bring it in under our terms. So I think this could just be waking us up to a larger process that seems to be happening, is a great forgetting that we may even be inverted plants, an offshoot of the microbial kingdom. There's very many questions that that we could legitimately be asking in this way. And so for me, you know, whether psychedelics are causing us to remember, or they're literally just allowing for our capacity to bring on new ideas that our culture hasn't really been asking for quite some time, but has been a part of our, you know, at least our ancestry for quite some time.
Yeah, it's hard-coded in there somewhere.
It is. So to me, I just like posing the questions. As a documentary maker, I like, you know, like hearing from all the experts and posing the questions. Is like, why would there be a class of plants like this? And I think all plant life is freaking incredible.
Do you think it extends to like the chemical compounds as well, LSD and MDMA?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, coming from ergot, obviously it goes through a process. But yeah, the chemical compounds, you know, like going deep into it, I like the idea of just using plants in their raw form, but it's also, that says a lot about me. I know I have a lot of friends who are extremely excited about the technological advancements and extremely excited about, you know, these chemical compounds, you know, just all of it, just being completely synthesized and being able to use it in that way. And I disagree, but then again, you know, this is the way that people's minds are kind of going. And these are people that are actually like lifelong people that are into plant medicines and they really enjoy it, but it's taking them into new directions.
Well, the fact is that synthetic psychedelic, I mean, there's never been a drug like LSD that a competent chemist could make millions of hits of in an afternoon. And it was perfectly packaged and perfectly presented in a way that was exactly right for the time. So whatever you think about plant teachers, the synthetics brought us back to them. And as Sasha says, you know, am I not part of nature too? Which I think is what Alexander Humboldt's line was as well. LSD gets a bad rap as being a synthetic, but there are LSAs in nature, in morning glory seeds, that are very, very, very close to LSD. It was just at the time we didn't have the technology to isolate them. So we found the simple drugs first, like DMT. I think we synthesized DMT before it was found in plants, didn't we?
Oh. Well, I like to think, you know, and I don't want to get into this as our closing question before we take questions from the audience, but I like to think everything is an extension of God and of the divine. Even, you know, if God is instilling us the ability to create chemical compounds, then it is a manifestation of the divine as well. So I don't really separate them myself.
Yeah, I just like to add something. You know, Ben was saying, isn't it such a mystery? You know, why do these plants exist that fit into our synapses just so perfectly, like lock and key, and have these effects of increasing ecological awareness and doing these things? You know, even more interesting, in addition to that, is that I learned from Paul Stamets that magic mushrooms, psilocybin mushrooms, tend to grow in areas where there are human disturbances and other construction sites, where they plow through roads, where they knock down trees, things like that. It's almost like it's a response from nature. It's almost like a hormonal response in the greater body of the planet that's releasing these things. The psilocybin mushrooms grow in areas where there is ecological destruction. Can that just be a coincidence that they make people more ecologically aware? So I think there's some kind of intelligence to nature, and there's some kind of agenda to what they're doing, and that we're not as much in control as we think we are. I love when Dennis McKenna had an ayahuasca experience. Apparently the ayahuasca spirit spoke to him and said, "You monkeys only think you're running the show."
Well, yeah, but I mean, I sort of also, when you talk about the ecological value of psychedelics, which of course I agree with, particularly ayahuasca, at the same time, sort of as what James was saying about the political system, it feels like we're getting an invitation from these compounds to commit on some deeper level to doing some type of restoration work for the planet. It's not clear that we're actually making that commitment or accepting that invitation, you know, at this point. You know, I had more hopes. When my first book, Breaking Open the Head, came out, you know, just maybe as your father thought when he discovered LSD, it was like, wow, this is going to change the consciousness of the planet in a week. I was like, wow, ayahuasca is, you know, if everybody gets a hold of this, it's going to bring about these deep structural changes. And now it's 17 years later, and it's, you know, it's 15 years later. There are changes happening. I see many people changing, like wealthy capitalists who do the medicine, who then change how they invest their wealth and so on. But at the same time, we have, you know, Scott Pruitt and kind of generally almost like a dissociative relationship to our environment. You know?
Well, Kurt Vonnegut in his final book tour, when he was going around the country, he was supposed to be penning his last book. He was talking about the condition of the human species and how he thought it was just a virus. We are a virus by the very definition.
Yeah, that's just negative and dumb.
It's very negative,
Yeah.
but it's an interesting. I mean, just.
And who cares anyway, if that's the case? It's still interesting.
Yeah. So we are going to take 10 to 15 minutes of some questions from the good people.
Or the bad people.
Or the bad people too. Especially the bad people, actually. So I think we're forming a queue over here. Yeah.
I'm a local optimist and global pessimist, and with the mindset is becoming more open. Our government is very military based, and while it's a seemingly obvious solution for PTSD, I feel like it would hurt getting the numbers in the military and people being obedient. So how do you change a government that's military based to have psychedelics when it's going to hurt the military, and when we're an oligarchy run by corporations, so that also hurts corporations?
And so I'm not trying to derail your question, but did everybody just hear about this latest utterance to come out of the Orange Clown's mouth about the Space Army?
Space Force.
The Space Force? He wants to create a sixth arm of the military, creating, out in space.
Death Star. Clone Wars is coming next.
Clone Wars is coming next.
Hey, Reagan wanted Star Wars.
Star Wars, right.
He reminds me of Reagan so much.
That's a very big question, and I think it's like, there's so many strands interwoven, right? Like a lot of the early research in LSD in the US was CIA research that led to Ken Kesey taking it, and now we're seeing the MDMA research on veterans, and like even Mercer, like the right-wingers are supporting that research with big grants and so on. So yes, everything you're saying is true, and hopefully there's like a seam that leads to something else.
I think I'm optimistic of that.
I'll throw one thing on top of that, just kind of piggybacking off of what you were saying, Daniel. Is 15 years has passed, and not much change we've seen. I know some people that have been taking the medicine for at least 10 years, probably a little more. And they're still dealing with their own individual vices and stuff like that. So if it translates, I'm not saying that, I know exactly how it works on a global or a cultural or a national scale, but if we're dealing with national vices, such as being in a military mindset, who knows? It could take longer, or it could take more, or just a different approach. But I still know people that have, for at least 10, 12 years, still working on cigarette addictions or alcohol addictions. It may be in the works. Who knows? It's just something I have to draw.
There's an incredible irony, though, that I'd just like to point out that one of the main reasons that psychedelics and LSD was made illegal back in the 60s was because people who did LSD didn't want to go fight in wars. That was, and now it's being legalized in research to treat veterans that come back from wars. So an incredible kind of full circle and irony in there.
And just if you're asking the question, if you want to address it to somebody specifically, or just for the general panel, but if you have it specifically, just for someone to say.
The industrial military complex, which these days it is, it's no longer a military industrial complex, it's now an industrial military complex. And they have no intention of giving up the reins. No amount of psychedelics is going to shift our cultural direction. I think psychedelics are here to band groups of us together, to learn to live together again, and to prepare for a very uncertain future.
First, I just want to echo the comment earlier of bringing a case to the Supreme Court to legalize psychedelics on the grounds of religious freedom. I think that's a fantastic idea that lawyers should be working on.
Well, to a certain extent, the ruling on the ayahuasca churches is in that direction. So there's already been some movement, but yeah, we don't. I would like to see a national. Like I think the Council of Spiritual Practices, Bob Jesse's organisation, is definitely doing good work, and I think within a few years we will see more of a push towards this idea of the legalisation of certain psychedelics, certainly the natural ones first. There's really no basis for it. They're non-addictive, they're non-toxic. There's not a lot of record of abuse.
And the question I would like to ask is, we discuss so much about ceremony, spirituality, mystical experience. How can we avoid the dangers and pitfalls associated with religions and cults as this community continues to evolve?
Well, I'm a huge fan of what I call the neutral container. I honestly think it's way more interesting to let people find what they find in the experience than creating a temple-y kind of. There's a lot of cultism going on these days, and I feel like we're almost falling back into the sort of new age. The same thing that did a lot of damage in the 60s is threatening to do a lot of damage again. We may look back on the mid-90s to early 2000s, ironically, as being a golden age of psychedelics, when they had the research chemical companies and there was a very small but very serious population.
You just made that in the last couple of last
I honestly been thinking about that a lot. I think it's funny the way that, we've got this mainstreaming of psychedelic culture going on, and it's getting diluted, and there's a lot of new agey sort of, there's no need to call something a temple or give it all the trappings.
I mean, another perspective would be that everything is a cult. Like, capitalism is a cult. Like, every culture is a cult. People experiment with new social formations, and you call them cults, you call them cultures or societies, So in a way, like, a lot of people love that Wild Wild Country documentary on Netflix about the Osho commune. One of the things I would have to say is those people were having an amazing time, like in living in bliss, and it looked fucking awesome, for a long time, until the whole thing went insane. So that was also the pressures from the outside. So like, so yes, we don't want gurus and Jonestowns and stuff like that, but recognizing that culture should always be an experiment, and new formations are super interesting, and new religions are super interesting. Like, why the hell not?
That's
why be so restrictive?
That's why I like the Burning Man model, because we all belong to something. And creating a container that allows you to belong.
Burning Man's an interesting example too, because I feel it's kind of gone more new age as the years have gone by. It had a real hacker, anarchistic.
Yeah, that's the worst problem for me is that it's crystallized into something like that's the other thing Terence McKenna talked about, how culture is our enemy, because when something settles into a culture, it becomes kind of like anti-creativity in a way. So now everybody knows how to be at Burning Man, what to wear, which DJs to listen to, and then it's dull. It's just dull.
The wonderful thing about psychedelics, and what I think would really help to put a break on them becoming involved in a kind of dogmatic religion or cult, is that by their very nature, the experience transcends culture. So I think by having these authentic spiritual experiences, I think is a way of helping to keep culture in check.
I don't agree, because for instance, I know like full-on ayahuasca cults in South America that have like evil leaders and so on. I mean, you can have psychedelics that lead to crazy circumstances with weird cults and leaders. So
setting apparently does.
But I don't think anything becoming successful is necessarily makes it a bad thing.
No, things like Burning Man and the direction that took, and a lot of groups, once they congeal and get enough identity of themselves, at least from my perspective, it always seems like it develops some sort of an immune system and attacks anything that seems to want to derail what it is in its existence and its trajectory. There's always going to be an evolution of things. Burning Man was never going to stay what it was. It was always going to turn into something more, and more people were going to show up, and those people were going to be something that the old cats were like, what the fuck are they doing?
It seems funny to me we keep falling back on this new age and 60s models.
Did that answer your question?
Thank you.
On the right here.
Hi, thanks for being up here. This isn't an insult to the five of you, but I think that you guys might have something thoughtful to say about it. As this psychedelic renaissance is occurring, what's it going to take for it to include communities of color, at least in America?
That's a great question. Fantastic.
No, I have to admit, when I was on the panel, and I typically didn't look that closely, but I was like, oh, it's a white man panel again. So I feel apologetic about that.
I think that is a very, very, very fantastic question, and that comes up probably one of the most common emails that I get from the MAPS podcast is, why don't I do more podcasts on that topic? And I hear you.
It may be an American issue, because essentially I spent the last couple of summers on the psychedelic trance circuit in Europe with all the festivals speaking at them, and they're extremely multi-ethnic. And it's not that people of colour don't like psychedelics. The psytrance tribe is very multi-ethnic. Lots of different languages, lots of different shades of colour. There's just something about
Russians, Ukrainians,
a lot
Belarusians.
of them too, but there's Indians, there's Japanese, there's people from everywhere. You know, it's really very multi-ethnic compared to the West Coast transformational scene. So I don't know if maybe it's. I think unfortunately this is a bit of a luxury in this country, and we are all entitled enough that we can come to something like this and discuss something as esoteric as psychedelics.
Yeah.
A lot of other people have just got more pressing concerns.
There's a guy around LA, his name is Tony Moss. I forgot the name of his organization. All right, there we go. Thank you. I Am Life, so, yeah. Oh, that side.
There's a fascinating history of black psychedelic use in this country that I wish somebody would tap into, because there was a considerable, I mean, in the
Totally, the 60s.
Psychedelic and all that stuff. I mean, those guys were using lots of acid.
George Clinton supposedly says he did acid every day for 4 years.
There's also a really good book called Sisters of the Extreme. I'm very sorry I'm forgetting the author's name, but that's also showing the women in history, people like Maya Angelou and quite a few others, and their experiences with psychotropics and psychedelics. So check that one out if you get the chance.
What's the title again?
It's Sisters of the Extreme.
Yeah, you know, I've been criticized. I've done 6 books of interviews, and many of the people I've interviewed are men. And I've been criticized a lot about it. That's why my new book is going to be Women in Visionary Art, entirely interviews with just women artists.
Over here.
So I actually had a similar question. So I find a lot of similarities amongst the philosophy of homosexuality and Black feminism from a psychedelic perspective. And so I was wondering if there's any research or conversations being had about how psychedelics can benefit social justice issues and racial trauma in communities.
Are you familiar with Nessie Davenport's work? Yeah, there's a woman called Nessie Davenport who did a really interesting thing on, she called it the queering of consciousness. And she was comparing psychedelics to a homosexual perspective, and there's a queering of consciousness. I think that might be something you'd be interested in. She's doing some interesting work in that area. Nessie Davenport.
Your question makes me think we should really give an ayahuasca session to James. Forgetting the 12 Rules for Chaos guy, Jordan Patterson. We should dose him.
He actually says that he has something else. Oh, really? Yeah. It's a great question, and I would love to know more myself. Do you have any thinkers or anybody that you know of that's explored that field or that area?
I don't know anyone that has linked intersectionality and psychedelics.
What do you see as the link? What do you see as the link? Or how would you make the link?
Well, intersectionality is defined as the interwoven systems of oppression that act simultaneously to oppress a person. So I see a lot of similarities as far as how things are connected and how they act to impact a person, how they act below the impact person also. So just connection.
I guess that's one reason why people tend to think that it's harder for people who are in kind of oppressed circumstances to do psychedelics, because they often make you so incredibly sensitized to that, the conditions of oppression.
Yeah, for me, psychedelics kind of introduced me to my relationship with Blackness, and so it's something that has been really profound in my life, and that I would like to share with other people. So I was just wondering.
I'd love to see more. I'd love to see more work and more fun of it, and I'd love to read something that you wrote or say about it.
Same.
In the last days, we've been hearing a lot about integration. It's been a common theme. Integration. It's been, I think, a common theme in almost everybody's talk and panel. And I'm just wondering, what conversation are we having to make sure we're not integrating with a sick society? How are we, what are we doing, what are we talking about to avoid integrating with the problem itself?
I think James actually mentioned a little bit of that earlier, is like with depression. Is it a disease, or is it a reaction to a system that seems to be dysfunctional? And I wouldn't say I have the best answer to that as far as being able to eloquate it right now. But I think through experiencing in your own way, in a container that you feel safe with, whether you want to call it intuition or something along those lines, I feel like there's some point with enough self-observation where you know whether something's off kilter or not, and even if you are still compelled in that direction, there's a lesson maybe to come from it. But I see where your question is coming from, at least I feel I do, and I feel that there's definitely a way that these plants can be used to simply just give ourselves a way through the mire without doing something for it or with it to better it. So I would say, again, I'm not advocating, I actually never advocate for people to try the plants. I just know that a lot of people are doing it, and I feel like the best way of doing that is to integrate it better with every other modality that we have to observe who we are. And I think we inside are the best barometer for exactly what we are integrating with, whether it be a family system or a societal system. We're probably the best barometer for that. The research, the intellectual side of it, and everything like that, that can inform and help it. But I still think it's all leading us back into, what are we? What is this phenomena? Is it all one continuous thing? And how can we move forward while orchestrating the most good?
I think it's a great question, and I think it's a big problem. I mean, now in a way, like certain facets of the culture, even of the very elite culture, have kind of assimilated psychedelic experience. I mean, there's now a circuit of people who go to these global festivals, Burning Man and Ibiza, wherever, and Tulum and so on. There's like a circuit, and it's become its own kind of hedonistic joyride. With this kind of veneer or overlay of spirituality, and I think it's a big problem. So I don't know what the answer is, but the ego is very good at assimilating anything, and psychedelics are another thing. They ultimately have initially a very profound impact on people. They often, make people better in many respects, but then the ego ultimately can figure out how to assimilate it as they can with anything.
And a lot of people just want to kind of tune out and numb out, like, as much of a deadhead as I am, and that was my first original tribe. I mean, you really saw it becoming such a huge problem towards the end. People just wanted just to check out and kind of do nothing.
I think what would be interesting would be if you had, because now there are these new modalities of doing them for healthy people, like, within sound meditations, assisted with psychoactives or ayahuasca ceremonies. If the end of that process was actually teaching around the structural injustices in society and the work that needs to be done to address them, and the ecological catastrophe that we have to address for the sake of our children. And at the moment I don't see that happening. It's become more of its own thing as a kind of adjunct to this new age culture, which is so based on the self and self-healing. It becomes another kind of sort of annoying thing that our culture is so good at producing as a kind of distraction mechanism.
I think it's just one thing my psychedelics really reinforced me, is that we live in two worlds, one that we can influence, one that we can't. And you know, to me, psychedelic use is a very personal thing, and it is to make your life the best life you can make it, living in this mad system that we're in.
That's our dichotomy.
You know, I think there's something to be said though for worrying about your own life, you know, your own, and making your own, controlling what you can, and then the rest of the world gets a little bit better because your world gets a little bit better.
So, we have time for one more question.
One more question.
Just one more? Yeah.
Question.
Is this a question? Is this a question?
All right.
Come on, one. Is this a question?
This is for Daniel. Are you familiar with the Hugh Everett many worlds interpretation on ends?
I'm not sure.
Okay. The string theory that you talked about is very convoluted, but Hugh Everett proposed, the parallel universes that exist, and I think that's a very nice attractive model of the exploration with DMT. You enter alternate realities, hyperdimensional spaces, and all of that. Now, with reference to people having the same visions, this is common. The Huichol peyote people, they have similar visions. Among the Shuar of Ecuador, they also have similar dreams. I asked my question at the beginning. And
I was a guest.
So I think the question is, what do you think of the concept of multiple dimensions?
Okay. One thing you were saying about the landscapes being similar is I do a lot of work with Alex Gray, and before I even knew Alex, I had a couple of experiences where I saw things that were very, very similar to his art. One time, extraordinarily so. And I thought that was very strange. I was like, because he's not my favorite psychedelic artist. He's one I like, but he's certainly not my favorite. And I thought, why all the different artists, that I had to see Alex's work. And when I've been with him, and so many people come up to him and they make the same comment, I saw this thing and it was exactly like your art. And Alex compares himself to the 19th century landscape painters who would come out west and would paint like El Cap and the Tetons and things like this, and they would take the paintings back to the East Coast, and no one would believe them that these incredible landscapes existed, 18th century maybe. So he says he very much he paints true vistas that other people can see. And I think that's one of the really most fascinating things about psychedelic culture and Stan Groff's work, that when you can actually, when we can get enough information, we can get enough feedback from people who start treating it a little more seriously, we can categorize these things. And when I wrote Trip to Eden Palace, I didn't know if anybody would resonate with the view that I had in that at all. It was just my view. And it's been really rewarding over the years how many people had resonated with that experience. So I think that's what makes it so interesting, is that we all had radically different experiences that maybe be a little less interesting.
Thank you.
Maybe just jump in and say there's different interpretive frameworks, the multi-world, multi-dimensions, or the Aboriginals talk about the dreamtime ancestors who just dream our world into reality, or now we have the transhumanist perspective that maybe what we're experiencing is somehow like a matrix, and behind it is a virtual reality projector or something. They might all be true in some fashion. But one thing that's so interesting about like a profound psychedelic experience with LSD, the first time you do it, or the second time, or the 10th time, is that sense you have of the inherent perfection of everything just as it is, which is kind of extraordinary.
I'm fairly certain that all of these guys will talk to you if you have any more questions after the panel. So let's give them a big round of applause. That's Stewart, David J. Brown, Dan Pinchbeck, James Oroc. I'm Zach Leary, and this is an episode of the LAPSS podcast. So if you want to listen to it, we'll put it up next week.